Officer Daniel Reed had worked in law enforcement long enough to recognize when something felt wrong, even when there was no obvious explanation for it. But on the morning he first saw the strange property listing on his computer screen, he had no idea that a simple decision driven by curiosity would soon lead him to uncover one of the most disturbing secrets his town had ever tried to hide. The listing itself looked almost ridiculous at first glance. A cave house for sale in the mountains, fully built interior cabin, private location, $400 cash only. Daniel stared at the screen for a moment, wondering if it had to be a joke or some kind of trap designed to lure curious buyers into wasting their time. Houses simply did not cost $400, not even abandoned ones. Yet something about the photographs attached to the listing caught his attention immediately. The images showed a massive cavern carved deep into the mountainside, and in the center of that cavern sat a small wooden cabin illuminated by shafts of sunlight pouring through cracks in the rock ceiling above. It looked peaceful, quiet, isolated from the world in a way that felt almost unreal. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. After years of working long shifts, responding to endless calls, and dealing with the stress that followed him home every night, the idea of owning a place completely removed from civilization suddenly felt incredibly appealing. When he showed the listing to a few other officers during their morning briefing, the reaction was immediate laughter. One of them joked that the cave was probably haunted, while another suggested the seller might be trying to lure someone into the mountains and rob them. Daniel laughed along with them, but the images stayed in his mind throughout the day. By the time his shift ended, he had already decided he needed to see the place for himself. The seller responded to his email almost instantly and instructed him to meet at the entrance to a remote hiking trail outside town. The next morning, Daniel drove into the mountains with his loyal German Shepherd police dog, Shadow, sitting proudly in the back seat of the truck. Shadow had been Daniel's canine partner for nearly 5 years, and during that time, the dog had proven himself to be one of the most reliable search animals in the department. The German Shepherd possessed an uncanny ability to sense danger long before any human could recognize it, and Daniel trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. When they arrived at the trailhead, a thin, older man with nervous eyes stepped out from behind a tree and handed Daniel a folded piece of paper that served as the property deed. The man barely spoke while accepting the envelope of cash, and within seconds he was already walking away down the trail without even turning back. Daniel frowned slightly at the strange behavior, but dismissed the thought as he began hiking toward the cave entrance with Shadow trotting ahead. The trail climbed steadily through tall pine trees before opening into a rocky clearing where the massive cavern mouth finally came into view. Daniel stopped in his tracks as he took in the sight. The cavern was enormous, easily large enough to swallow an entire house, and the cool air drifting from its entrance carried a faint earthy smell. When Daniel switched on his flashlight and stepped inside, the beam revealed something even more unexpected than the photographs had shown. Sitting quietly in the center of the cavern was a small log cabin built with careful craftsmanship. It looked like someone had spent months constructing the structure deep inside the mountain. Daniel let out a quiet whistle.
I need you to check
"Well,
the perimeter
Shadow,"
of that
he said,
cabin, understand?
"looks like we just bought ourselves a cave." But the dog did not wag his tail or respond with excitement. Instead, Shadow froze completely. His ears lifted sharply, and his body became rigid as he stared toward the back wall of the cabin. Daniel immediately recognized the posture. This was the stance Shadow used whenever he detected something unusual during search operations. Slowly, the German Shepherd stepped forward, sniffing the air with increasing intensity before letting out a low, warning growl. Daniel followed him inside the cabin, shining the flashlight across the wooden walls and dusty floorboards. At first, everything looked abandoned but intact. A small wooden table stood near the window, and a simple bed frame rested against the far wall. Yet Shadow continued to stare at one particular section of the cabin, as if something invisible had captured his attention. Then, suddenly, the dog began barking. Not a playful bark or even a warning toward a stranger. This was the kind of bark Shadow used during rescue operations when he discovered someone trapped or hidden. The sound echoed loudly through the cavern. Daniel approached the wall carefully and knocked on the wooden boards with his knuckles. The hollow echo that returned made his heart skip a beat. Something was hidden behind the wall. Shadow began scratching at the baseboards with frantic urgency, sending splinters flying across the floor. Daniel grabbed a metal pry bar leaning in the corner of the cabin and wedged it between two planks. After several minutes of effort, one of the boards finally cracked loose and fell away. Behind it was darkness. When Daniel shined his flashlight into the opening, he saw the top of a narrow wooden ladder descending into the ground beneath the cabin. A cold chill ran down his spine. Someone had built a secret chamber below the house. Without hesitation, Shadow stepped forward and looked down into the darkness. Daniel took a deep breath and began climbing down the ladder. Each rung creaked beneath his weight as the light above slowly faded behind him. When his boots touched the floor, he realized he was standing in a small underground room carved directly into the stone. Blankets were piled in one corner, and melted candle stubs clung to the walls. A metal cup rested beside what looked like the remains of dried food. Someone had been living here. Shadow moved slowly around the chamber before stopping beside the wall. Daniel followed the dog's gaze and noticed hundreds of small tally marks carved into the stone. Each mark represented a day. Someone had been counting time while hiding in this room. Then Shadow sniffed something lying on the ground near the corner. It was a dusty notebook. Daniel picked it up and brushed away the dirt. The cover was scratched with two letters carved deeply into the leather. A.R. The initials sent a sudden jolt of recognition through Daniel's mind. Abigail Rowan, a teenage girl who had disappeared from town 3 years ago. At the time, the case was closed quickly, with the assumption that she had run away. But as Daniel opened the notebook and began reading the pages inside, he realized the truth was far more terrifying. Abigail's handwriting described weeks of fear, hiding and running through the mountains while someone hunted her. The final entries contained a warning written repeatedly across several pages. "He works with the police. I heard his voice on the radio. Don't trust him." Daniel's blood ran cold as the meaning of those words began to sink in. Suddenly, Shadow lifted his head and growled toward the ladder above them. Daniel listened carefully and heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the cavern. Someone else had entered the cavern. Moments later, a figure appeared at the top of the ladder. When Daniel looked up, his stomach tightened. The man staring at him was Lieutenant Harris, the same officer who had closed Abigail's disappearance years earlier. Harris sighed as if disappointed. "You should have left this alone, Reed," he said calmly. Daniel tightened his grip on the notebook. "You knew she was here." Harris pulled a handgun from his jacket. Before he could raise it, Shadow launched himself up the ladder with explosive force and slammed into Harris's arm. The gun clattered across the stone floor. Daniel rushed upward and tackled the lieutenant, while Shadow barked furiously beside them. Minutes later, the sound of approaching police sirens echoed through the mountains as backup officers arrived. Harris was taken into custody, and the truth about Abigail's disappearance finally began to surface. But the story was not finished. In the final pages of the notebook, Abigail had written a message pointing toward the northern mountains. Weeks later, while Daniel and Shadow returned to the cave one morning, Shadow suddenly froze again and began running toward the cabin. When Daniel stepped inside, he saw a thin young woman standing near the bed. Her long brown hair hung loosely around her shoulders, and tears filled her eyes as she saw the dog. "Shadow," she whispered. The German shepherd wagged his tail and walked forward as she fell to her knees and hugged him tightly. Abigail Rowan had survived 3 years alone in the wilderness, hiding until the man who hunted her was finally stopped. As Daniel watched the reunion, he realized that if Shadow had not trusted his instincts and barked at that wall, the secret hidden inside the cave might have remained buried forever. And sometimes the courage of a single loyal dog is enough to bring the truth back into the light.